Good evening, one and all. So today's lesson, what we're going to be doing is taking the knowledge that we've gained from our previous lessons, where we've been looking at all sorts of different extreme weather patterns across the world, and we're going to start to bring things back home. And we're going to start to bring things back home by having a little look at some of the weather hazards that impact us in the United Kingdom. Now, this lesson is going to work a little bit differently. Rather than me stopping and doing a real-time lesson, there's going to be a link which will be in the description to this YouTube video to a Google form, and within that Google form there'll be a series of tasks that I want you to complete, and it will all culminate and end in one particular describe style exam question. So I'll just present my screen to you now, just so that you can see what we're aiming to achieve during today's lesson, and also so that you can see the direction that we're going in achieving that final question by the time we get to the end. So as I mentioned, today's lesson is going to be about extreme weather hazards in the United Kingdom. Okay, so in order for us to be able to achieve what we need to achieve today, I want you to be able to identify 5 different weather hazards that affect and impact the UK. I want us to be able to explain how extreme weather in the UK occurs. So there's kind of 2 sides to it, really. There's the physical geography side of it and the understanding of how the weather and climate can impact upon the UK, but then there's the human geography side of it, which is all about how those extreme weather and hazard events can have an impact upon our lives. And you've got an example there in that picture that's down in the bottom right hand side of a lightning storm. That's just one example of some of the many extreme weather events that can impact on the UK. Now, the last question on the Google form that you're going to be completing as part of this lesson is going to be the question that you can see up on your screen at the moment as your target question. And it says, describe how 2 types of weather hazard could affect the UK. So we're looking at 2 types of weather hazard in particular, and we're going to see if we can describe not just what the hazard is, but how it will impact upon people. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we can use connectives in order to be able to do that, to guide you through that process. So without further ado, the first thing that we need to know, and you should know this from previous lessons, but let's just make sure that we're all on the same page and wavelength, is to be able to explain the difference between the weather and the climate. So it's important to remember that the weather is the day-to-day changes in the atmosphere. I always liken it to what I look at when I look out of my window in the morning. Okay, I draw my curtains, I can see that it's sunny outside. That's the weather. Doesn't mean it's sunny every day. It's just sunny at that given moment in time. Climate is something which is slightly different. Climate is the average conditions over a long period of time. And usually when we do that, we will use data over 30 years or more. You'll notice that I've put a picture of the President of the United States of America down there in the bottom right hand side, Donald Trump. The reason why I've put that picture of Donald Trump down in the bottom right hand side is because he's someone who clearly does not know the difference between weather and climate. I remember watching various videos of his rallies where it would be cold and snowy outside, and he would come in fist pumping saying, well, what happened to global warming? Has anyone been outside? It's freezing. Obviously, what he's talking about is not climate change. It's not climate. He's talking about the weather, and the weather can change on a day-to-day basis. So now that we've got that clear distinction between weather and climate, what we're looking at is extreme weather events. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the patterns of those weather events aren't linked to the climate. And we'll talk about that particularly when we start thinking about weather hazards such as heat waves and also snow events, because there is a link to our climate change and some of those weather events and weather patterns that we may or may not see more or less of. So the first thing that we need to know is we need to know the physical geography side of this. Okay. Now, here is a map, and it's a map that hopefully you've come across before further down the schooling key stage 3, which shows us the different air masses that impact upon the weather in the United Kingdom. Now, there are 2 primary words that you need to be aware of on this particular diagram. The first word here, I'm just going to highlight with my cursor, is polar. Okay, so whenever we're talking about a polar air mass, we're talking about it being cold. Easy way to remember that really is to think of polar bears. Polar bears live in a cold environment. So if we've got polar air coming over the UK, it's cold air that's coming over the UK. The opposite side of that is this word here, tropical. Okay, again, nice easy one to remember. When we start thinking of a tropical environment, we tend to think of holidays, summer, the heat. Okay, and that brings us these warm air masses. The other 2 words that you need to be aware of is what these are combined with. So you've got the word maritime and you've got the word continental. Now, if you've got an air mass which is continental, what that means is it's blowing over a continent. And if it blows over a continent, it's not picking up moisture with it because it's blowing over land. So that tends to bring us dry weather. Where you've got a maritime air mass, that means that it's blowing over the ocean. And if it's blowing over the ocean, it tends to pick up lots of moisture with it, which means that we get lots of precipitation or lots of rainfall to go with it. Here at the top, you've got an Arctic maritime air mass, very similar to polar maritime, but that would be sort of the real extreme of cold weather, the sort of weather that descends the whole of the UK, depending on the location of the jet stream, with lots and lots and lots of snow. So essentially, where our weather comes from and the time of year can be determined by these what our weather is, can be determined by these air masses. So if it's the summer and we've got a tropical continental air mass moving over the UK, so in other words, our weather is coming from down here in the southeast, we're more likely to get warm, dry weather, the sort of weather that would give us heat waves. Likewise, if it's the winter and we get an Arctic maritime or a polar maritime air mass, it tends to bring cold weather, but also cold, wet weather, which will usually bring us snow as our extreme weather event. So because of that, what we end up with in the UK is what I would call an extreme weather roundabout. So depending on whereabouts the weather is coming across, will depend very much on what types of extreme weather we can get. So we've mentioned here that if we've got air coming down from the Arctic, it can bring heavy snow, which is bitterly cold, particularly in the winter. We can, in the summer, get hot, sunny weather, which comes across from these tropical continental air masses, which bring us heat waves and extreme droughts. We also get storms which come across the Atlantic, and quite often these are the remnants or the tail ends of hurricanes, and when they come across and they batter the UK, they can hit us with really, really extreme winds, which can cause lots of problems, particularly in coastal areas. And then we also get severe weather that can come from the east, and that can be extreme cold, it can be extreme warm, it very much depends upon the time of year that we've got. It's also worth noting that with our prevailing winds, the vast majority of our weather comes down here from the southwest, which brings us these tropical maritime air masses. And what that usually culminates in is in the winter, we get those sort of days where it's not particularly cold, but it's a bit bleak and it's a bit wet. And in the summer, we get those sort of warm days where we've got lots of moisture and lots of precipitation in the air. Doesn't mean our weather always comes in that way, but that is the general direction that our weather patterns begin to follow. So I've already mentioned a few of the extreme weather patterns that particular profile can bring out. And the first one is thunderstorms. You can see a really, really striking, pardon the pun, picture there of some thunderstorms over Canary Wharf in London. So we get battered by thunderstorms all the time. Usually these happen during hot weather when we've got convection storms. And these electrical storms in 2014 resulted in 3,000 lightning strikes across southern Britain. And it's all linked to this hot weather. Now, although the thunderstorm can be a hazard because it can catch fire to trees, it can strike buildings, it can kill people if it strikes them, it's the torrential rain that usually combines with the thunderstorms to create floods, which generates the hazard. And what I really want to bring home to you is that none of these one single hazards can be looked at in isolation. They often interlink with one another. So if we take the case of thunderstorms, for example, they have a link to prolonged rain. So where we get persistent rainfall or precipitation, that can lead to river floods. And we tend to get these in the UK at all times of the year, really. You can see a picture down here in the bottom right. This is of a village called Boscastle, which flooded in 2004. That flooded in the height of summer in the middle of August when it was very, very warm, and we got a convection rainfall storm that was very localized that occurred. But we can get them quite often in winter and early spring, particularly if you go to higher land where snow is melting. This can make things a lot worse. 2014 was a year of particular note where there was massive widespread flooding across southern England, and that was because of prolonged rainfall and move over the UK. We also end up with waves, and this is where we get long dry spells with no precipitation. I live in the southeast of England, okay, as do you guys. If you live in the southeast of England, we actually live in one of the driest areas of the country, where we quite often receive long spells where we get little or no precipitation. Now, I said to you we need to start thinking about the knock-on effects of this. Well, the knock-on effect is if we get long spells with no precipitation, our rivers dry up and our reservoirs become dangerously low. And if I was going to use connective to be able to explain that, I would say that the rivers dry up, the reservoirs become dangerously low. Therefore, we lack water supplies, which can have an effect on wildlife, which means that we can't water crops. Okay, and those are the connective words that we need to use. Now, there's loads of examples of this. A big one is 2003, when there was a huge heat wave across Europe, which killed 20,000 people in several countries, including the United Kingdom. But most recently, in 2018, there was a huge heat wave, and there were lots of crop failures due to a lack of water across the UK. That was most recent. I remember that pretty well. I also remember 2003 pretty well, to be fair, because I remember sitting some of my mock exams at that point, and it was very, 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 very warm. These sorts of things I think we are going to see more of, and we're going to see more of as our climate starts to change. We're probably likely to experience more droughts and more heat waves moving forward into the future. So our politicians, our governments will need to make sure that they're planning provisions so that we can mitigate them, so that we can deal with the impacts of droughts and heat waves. Quite interestingly, actually, I'm going slightly off topic here, but when we start thinking about reservoirs becoming dangerously low, a lot of that actually is often not to do with the heat wave itself. It depends on how much rain has happened over the course of the winter. If you get a heat wave, as we did in 2018, but there was lots of rain the winter before, actually that becomes less a problem. If, like in 2003, you have a heat wave and there's not much precipitation during the winter, that can cause problems in terms of the amount of water that's available in reservoirs. The other one, and we're seeing less of this, is heavy snow and extreme cold. So we can get long periods of severe winter weather, although they have become less common in recent years. However, it is worth noting that heavy snow can still cause hardship in the UK, especially in the north. And you can see that picture there of a gridlocked motorway. Now, because we don't get heavy snow and extreme cold as often as perhaps maybe we used to, we don't really plan for it particularly well. And when we do get hit by lots of heavy snow, it can be really disruptive because we don't have the infrastructure to be able to deal with it. We don't have the snow plows, we don't have the gritters, we don't have the snow tires on our cars. And if you compare that to perhaps maybe some of the Scandinavian countries, which are used to the extreme cold, there's a big, big difference between them. And then finally, strong winds. We do get strong on the west coast of the UK. We get battered by strong winds, and sometimes the remnants or the ends of hurricanes that are crossing the Atlantic. Remember, we don't suffer from hurricane and around the equator. That's where we get that huge uplift of moisture, which creates those thunderstorms, which can generate those hurricanes and those tropical storms. But, strong winds can still cause damage in the UK. It can cause power supplies, it can cause trees to fall over, and it can cause all sorts of issues in terms of our roads and in terms of our infrastructure, destroying rail lines as well. There are lots of impacts that come from strong winds. Here's an example. We quite often hear in the news about different storms across the UK. That's because the Met Office have now started naming some of the storms. Here's an example from a report in the newspaper. It says strong winds bring chaos to the UK. There's widespread disruption to road and rail networks, leaving 21,000 people without power as strong winds continue to batter the UK this week. Electricity supplies were affected in South Wales, the Southwest and the Midlands. Wind speeds of up to 105 miles per hour were recorded in Aberdaron in northwest Wales, with gusts of up to 92 miles an hour on the Gower Peninsula in southwest Wales. And what's interesting actually about this story is that a lot of those locations are located in the west. So, that's where you've got the remnants of the hurricane, which is coming across in our prevailing winds and hitting the southwest of the UK. It says there that the Met Office has warned that coastal areas in the UK could be battered by large waves. The Clifton Suspension Bridge, again, still in the west of England, was in Bristol, was closed for the first time ever due to high winds. So it's about starting to think about what the impacts of these might be. Now, that's relatively common sense, I think, in terms of being able to respond to the question which says describe 2 types of weather hazard that can affect the UK. Well, basically, you've got your pick of all of those different weather hazards that we've talked about, winds and thunderstorms. Now, in terms of being able to respond to that question, if you're describing how, and that's the key word there, how 2 types of weather hazards can affect the UK, you need to not just say what the weather hazards are, but you need to be able to give some indications that you understand what the impacts of those weather hazards might be. So if I were to give you an example, I could say one weather hazard that impacts the UK is heat waves. Because of heat waves, we end up with droughts and reservoirs and rivers running dry. This means that it's difficult to get water supplies. Therefore, it's hard to water crops, which leads to crop failure. And what I've done is I've taken a really simple sentence and I've used those connective words. Therefore, this means that, consequently, in order to be able to explain the knock-on effects. Now, I've given you one example. What I want you to do is I want you to go away and I want you to start thinking about how you can use those skills to put it into a second example. Now, in the comment, not in the comment box, but in the caption box underneath this video on YouTube, what I've done is I've put a link in there to a Google form. And the Google form that's in that link will take you to a series of tasks. And within those tasks, I want you to work through them logically, and it will culminate in this target question, which is there, that says describe how 2 types of weather hazard can affect the UK. And within that Google form, you will get responses and you'll be able to get live marking to some of the things that you've been doing within this particular lesson itself. So hopefully on the basis of that, then we should be able to identify 5 different weather hazards that affect the UK and use connectives to be able to explain them. And you should have some knowledge and understanding of how those different air masses will impact upon the different types of weather that we might find in and around the UK. As we start to move on, what we'll do is we'll move away from the UK. Well, no, we'll stay in the UK rather, and we'll have a look at some examples of each other and how that's impacted upon people's lives.